right, Sumerians. They are located, or they inhabited, I should say, the southern part of Mesopotamia. You can see where the arrow is pointing to there on the map. Now, all of this region that we're looking at in Chapter 2 was organized into city-states. And city-states are basically towns that share religious and cultural values, but they operate as separate political entities with their separate territories. And this is why there's constant struggle, because one city-state wants to dominate another one, wants to get its resources, and so on. And we'll see how that plays out as well. Deities. Presumably, all these city-states were ruled by different Mesopotamian deities. Each city-state had its own patron god or goddess, and believe it or not, the city's dominance depended on its deity being more powerful than the rest, or being pleased more with the people, and so on. Now, what about the ruler? The ruler was perceived as the earthly representation of the divine. The kings weren't divine themselves, but they were controlled by the gods, yet they played as that middleman, right? There was no division between government and religion. In Sumer, the religion was so closely tied to the state that if the gods were pleased, then the state prospered. If the gods were not pleased, well, the people would suffer. Now, in terms of organization of the labor force, what does this mean and what does it allow? This extensive labor force was very specialized, which means different individuals were doing different things. And the development of agriculture was really only for a portion of the population. They had to work to produce the food. That means others could specialize in things such as trade, administration, manufacturing, and other sorts of activities. And all of these are basically the hallmark of the first complex urban societies. Now, this time with the Sumerians, we have the introduction of writing. So let's move on to our next slide and explore what this writing was, what it looked like, and what it meant. And this is what it looks like. It's called cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped, because that's what the symbols look like. It's the earliest known writing system that we have. Now, scholars are actually able to read ancient Sumerian, and this is a big accomplishment for us, because we can actually know about the rulers' names, about the deities, and so many other things. Now, why do you think they invented writing? Basically, it was first invented to express administrative, economic, and commercial transactions. And then it develops into literature, which is the next slide that we're going to look at. And here is one of those tablets. This is the Gilgamesh tablet, depicting one of the earliest epics that we have, one of the most famous, greatest literary works ever written. And it's a heroic story, of course, between Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, and his adventures and his slaying of monsters, and so on. And in fact, this tablet is actually one of thousands that have been excavated here. So we have a lot of these that we've found, and lots of information that's available to us as well. Alright, it's also important to talk about the seals. Now, notice how big or small, I should say, they are. They're about 2 inches high, so literally maybe just a thumb size, right, the height of your thumb. But they are critical, so they would have been like the form on the right, and then you would have pretty much rolled them across clay and then created those images and patterns on them. Now, these were used for many purposes, designating ownership, keeping inventories and accounts, legalizing documents, and these are a really important source for us, because when we find these patterns and imprints in other parts of the world, we know that they had contact with the Sumerians of this time. So very important in terms of establishing that relationship and contact with other areas of the world. These are not isolated societies, they're actually societies that are in contact with other areas. Alright, here's your white temple at Uruk, which is modern-day Warka. This is one of your earliest examples of Sumerian temple architecture. Of course, it doesn't look like it did back when it was first created, but let's take a look at what it looks like today. And you can see it's pretty much like a mountain. You can see some form. Let's look at the next slide and see what else we can find. Here again, similar, a little bit of a different viewpoint, but not much has been left, right? But you can still see this elevated structure. This is something built on top of what looks like a plateau. And this is another great photograph to show you the steps that would be leading up to the small temple at the very top of this man-made mountain, basically. So it's a great photo to give you another glimpse of this area. this is what we believe a reconstruction of it would have looked like. So you can see that what appeared as a plateau or a mountain is actually a constructed ziggurat. It's actually a constructed form that would have been created by a large labor force. And then on top of it, you would have had your temple, very, very small temple that would have been put on top of it. So let's kind of think about what a Sumerian city plan would have looked like. Well, temples like this one would have been in the central part of the city. So that tells us right then and there that it was a religious, administrative, and economic center. It was the heartbeat of the city-state. So if you were to hover over the city, kind of fly over it, you would see this temple as its central focus. I want you to think about it for a second. What is our city's center? I mean, if you look down from an airplane while you're landing into your city, what do you see, right? Are they skyscrapers, freeways, fields, stadium, right? What is it that we see, And think about how that reflects our culture, right? That is what's important, is the structures that are central, the structures that are huge, the structures that take up so much space in our land. And that's exactly how these ziggurat temples would have functioned as well. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at what it looks like today and what it used to look like, or a reconstruction of it, let's get down to the 5 main points, the 5 features of the Sumerian worship structure. The first of all, very, very important, it was built on a ziggurat. In other words, it's a high platform. Now, this area is essentially flat desert landscape, right? So you want to ask, why did they construct these platforms? Why the emphasis on height, right? So first of all, it's a link or a portal to the heavens, and they believe that's where the priests and the gods could commune together. So the higher you are closer to the place where the gods would reside. Another reason for building it on a ziggurat is that it was equivalent to mountains, and mountains were considered sacred for Sumerians. They were a source of water, a place of refuge during floods, as well as symbolizing the earth's regenerative power. Another reason to build on ziggurats, well, it made the temple more visible, right? I mean, you're higher up, you can see it from any part of town, right, as a central focal point, so why not? And there's a lot of information in Mesopotamian texts that indicate that the act of seeing was so significant. So in other words, if a god could see an object, could find it, it's likely that the god or goddess would act favorably toward the people who made it. So why not, right? The whole purpose here is to please the gods. And a fourth reason why they built on a ziggurat is a political dimension. I mean, really, only few people could go up there. The ruler, of course, certain priests, right? So that would emphasize how the priests and the rulers were separate from the rest of the community who would be down on level ground watching the action take place. Really, really important to think about the purpose of building it on a ziggurat. Point number 2, they used mud brick. Now, they did not have access to any stone quarries, so what they would do is they would create these mud brick, and then they would cover it with plaster. Now, the thing with mud brick, as you've seen in the photos, especially the one on the right, it doesn't survive. I mean, this is fragile, and eventually, through the years and years and years, it starts to disintegrate. But they still built towering temples, which tells us what? Their desire to show their gods their love, right? Their devotion. They wanted to create monumental settings to worship their deities. This is so important to the purpose of these Sumerian temples. Third point, the bent axis approach, or an indirect approach. Now, this basically means that there is a stairway that leads you to the top, but it changes directions 2 to 3 times, right? So it goes one direction, and then it kind of curves around it, and then around it, and so on. So what we want to ask is, why would they do that? Why use that approach? So part of the thing is, it makes the approach to the top part of the worship process. I mean, we ourselves are such a product-focused culture that the journey is sometimes forgotten, right? In this case, though, when you're intentionally moving and you're aware of changing directions, it makes the journey very much acknowledged, right? It's intentional. It humbles you. It prepares you for going up to the top and entering a divine realm and a divine space. Now, the other thing about, 3 different sides and several different sides incorporated is a community who is down below witnessing the ceremonial ascent can see it from any angle, from any side. And that's really, really important because they can cannot go up there, but they could still be part of that process, right? And before we get to point number 4 and 5, I have a kind of funny example to show you. So let's take a look at that first. Now, before I show you the photo, here is what the bent axis approach would have looked like, right? Pretty much changing directions as it leads up to the temple. And you can see the temple with the kind of a blocky form right at the very top with a cella right in the middle of it. Now, what about this? For those of you who are Pierce College students, you will recognize this as the steps that actually lead you up to the art department where these classes are normally held. Now you can see what's going on. It changes direction. It is interspersed with the trees, the planters, right? So it's kind of engaging the climb up, but trying to make it a little bit more interesting. So it's not this massive 100+ steps all the way straight up. I often tell my students if that was the case straight up, I might not be getting some of my students to attend. But just a deviation in path, the intrigue with some of the trees and things that kind of pepper the pathway here makes it so much more interesting, and I get students who actually come up to class. But it's just a modern day example. You know, you want to think about how are your spaces constructed? How are you manipulated to walk in a certain way? How are you meant to experience these places, right? This one is one of my favorite places, the Getty Center, and we're specifically looking at the central garden created by Robert Irwin. You'll notice here the path that doesn't go straight down into that central, fountain area, but actually zigzags all the way through. And Robert Irwin himself said that the intention of this was to slow you down, to make you really acknowledge where you are and what you're experiencing. And you'll notice in the outer areas of the zigzaggy path, it's just flat lawn, right? And those are the areas you wanted to contemplate about what you had just encountered in that central area, right? So the foliage and the trees and the colors and textures, and then you'd come out to the corner of the zigzag, think about that, and then go right back in for another experience. So once again, here we're looking at how space and landscape and architecture are really working to create a certain kind of experience. So this is a great contemporary example, contemporary connection of what we're studying in this chapter with the ziggurat temples of the Sumerians. All right, let's continue. Point number 4, astronomical alignment. And what that basically means is that the corners of the temple were oriented to the cardinal points on the compass, north, east, south, and west. Point number 5, it was a small temple with a cella at the very top. Now the temple was considered a waiting room, which basically meant that they would wait for the deity to descend, to commune with the priests. Now inside of the waiting room, inside of the temple, was a cella, the innermost, most sacred part where there was an altar for the deity, and that's where the god or goddess would come in to commune with them. Let's look at a picture of that just to make it a little bit more clear. So you can see the cella marked in red, the innermost sacred part of the temple. Now the other rooms around it that you can notice were offices, the priests' quarters, or where they would store important objects related to worship and to the deity. So we conclude our understanding of these ziggurat temples by asking the question, what was the purpose or the function? 2 things to keep in mind. First of all, it glorified the gods, right? Whatever god was supposed to be represented, or whatever patron goddess was part of that city-state, that was the person or the being that was glorified. Second point about the purpose and function, it showed the wealth, the prestige, and the stability of the city's rulers. Very, very important. The Sumerians accomplished a number of things, and one of the main ones is that they were the first to use pictures to tell coherent stories. And so here we have one of the first great narrative works of art. It is a work of vase, or otherwise known as a presentation of offerings to Inanna. Now, Inanna is the patron goddess. A few other terms to note before we actually discuss what is depicted on the vessel itself. First of all, the registers or the friezes. These are basically the panels that you're looking at. There are several panels, and they're divided by ground lines. Now, the yellow arrow points to the ground line. So they divide up the registers and the friezes, and within each register, there is something depicted, whether it's plants, animals, people, or a portrait or an image of the goddess. Now, this vessel itself is considered a votive offering, and what that means is that it is a gift of gratitude to a deity, often in fulfillment of a vow or a prayer or as a desired end, trying to get something from the god or goddess. Now, the last term, very critical in our study of art history in this whole chapter as well as semester, is what's called the hierarchy of scale. In essence, this is when things that are more important are larger in size, and it's sometimes unproportionally larger. And you can notice that in some of the images here, for example, in the top register, that central image of the woman, she seems larger, primarily because of the headdress. And we'll see a lot more examples coming up in the battle scenes and other works of art from this chapter, as well as the chapters to come. All right, let's begin to look at the various sections, and we're going to start from the bottom up. So in the lowest band, or the lowest register, we have the natural world. We have water, and that's represented by the wavy lines that you notice. Remember, irrigation was critical and very important to their agricultural lifestyle. So next register up is the other part of the natural world, which are the plants. In this case, scholars have suggested that these are date palm and barley that we notice. And they're basically possessions of the goddess, right? The grain. Now, another component is the next register up, which are the animals, right? And these are ewes and rams. These are staple commodities of Sumerian economy, and they're also associated with fertility. So what are you looking at? Water, plants, and animals. In other words, Inanna has blessed the people of Uruk with good crops, good water, and increased herds. Really, really important to their livelihood, as you can imagine. In the central band, we notice naked men with baskets and jars that are totally overflowing with abundance. I mean, all the things in the lower levels that you see with the plants and other things, these are just overflowing out of their baskets. So there's so much gratitude there. And they're in a procession to go all the way up to the temple to give some of this back to the goddess as a votive offering, as a thanksgiving, as a gift of gratitude. And then finally, in the uppermost register, we see the offerings that are made to Inanna. That's Inanna right there with the big, huge headdress, right, which is indicating the most important person in that register. So she is represented in the hierarchy of scale stylistic element that we discussed earlier. So what is the interpretation of the scene? Like, what is going on? Well, you're looking at a religious festival that honors the goddess Inanna, in this case, Queen of Heaven for the Sumerians of Uruk. It's also symbolic. It's a symbolic marriage between the goddess and the human, in this case, kind of a priest king, both a political and a religious leader. So why is this important? Well, because this union, this symbolic marriage, ensures that Inanna will continue her goodwill. She will continue to ensure the fertility of the crops, the animals, but the people as well. Now, another interpretation with that is it also reaffirms a leader's exalted position, right, in society. He is the one who's getting the goodwill from the goddess. And remember, so all of these religious structures, religious objects, they also continually reinforce the role of the ruler as that middleman with or between the people and the gods. And this slide is just here for you to see some of the details of the components that we just talked about, right? The water, the plants, the animals, the people in the procession, and then finally the goddess at the very top. And of course, don't forget the whole structure of the vessel going from the bottom up is almost like the procession going from ground level up to the temple, into the cella, to the altar where the goddess's sculpture would have been and where worship would have fully been taking place. So this worker vase is basically a historical document, right? It tells us something about their belief system, their practices, their lives. So once again, the question here is, what can we tell about the Sumerians from this vase? What information does this object give us, which is what we've just completed studying? So first of all, the importance of the gods, right, and how they were worshipped, the rituals related to them, and so on. Second of all, the role of the ruler, right? What we're calling iconography of power. What is it about the ruler that stands out, right? The ruler is the one who has contact with the gods, who has to ensure these festivals are conducted, and who's the one who can go to the temple. So visually, he's the one who's going up to the temple top, right? And thirdly, another significance about these objects is they reveal their life and the practices, right? The economy of the Sumerians, the festivals, what was important for them, the animals, the plants, the role of water, and so on. So you always want to make sure after every work of art that we study in the semester, you ask yourself the same question. What can we tell about this culture based on this object? I just wanted to show this image. It's kind of heartbreaking. But this was one of the things that was missing from the Baghdad Museum during the Iraq War. And you can see that they've retrieved it, they found it, but it was in fragments, right? And some parts of it were broken off. And just with the tender care of a surgeon working on a human body, you can see these guys here really tenderly trying to clean up and preserve and restore this really significant object of our artistic history. So, in addition to images of the divinities, vases, food offerings, the temples were also filled with statues of these types of individuals. We know now that they were actually worshippers, and we know that because of several inscriptions that we found on many of these that have actually been located. Now, these inscriptions give names of the donors. Sometimes they're very specific prayers. Sometimes they talk about the donor and all the wonderful things he or she has done for the god and for his honor. So lots of kind of self-praise, but at the same time, inscriptions acting as votive offerings, right? So we found a lot of these. They're in the temple, beneath the floor of the temple, and they pretty much look very similar to this that we're looking at. Let me show you a group of them. Here they are. Here's a group, kind of like a family portrait, I like to call it. And you can see they have very similar features, right? They're all have their hands either folded in a gesture of prayer, or they're holding small beakers that would have been used in the various religious rituals that would be taking place. The men have these long, very stylized beards. They're all wearing a very typical kind of skirt with their fringes at the bottom, shoulder length hair for the men, and all of them have these wide open eyes that they're looking out at us with. Now, the symbolism of the eyes, right? Why? I mean, why is it so significant? What's going on? Well, they indicate eternal wakefulness. This is necessary because their duty is to pray constantly on the donor's behalf, right? Now, the donors, they couldn't go up into the small cella. Like, that's way too small. Only specific individuals from the culture could actually go up there. So the eyes, eternally wakeful, are in constant prayer. Right? Now, the cuneiform writings also reveal the importance of approaching a god with this attentive gaze. I mean, awe-inspired, right? Just you're in this wow that you are in the god's presence. And that's what we also think that this gaze, these open wide eyes, also reference. Now, something that's also familiar for us is that eyes are believed to be the seat of the soul. So here it is, the worshiper opening up his soul to the deity and really communing with the deity. And finally, in that communication, right, in that channel of communication, the deity is receiving the worship and therefore will continue blessing the worshiper, whom these statues represent. Now, what about the purpose of these, right? So here's the thing. The worshiper, again, cannot be up in the temple, right? But if the statuettes were up there, they would be always praying. They'd be constantly in worship, in awe, eternally awake, right? And that's what the worshiper wanted, right? These are mere mortals who are coming into the presence of the gods and want to be always in that state of awe and reverence. All right, let's consider this work. It's called The Fragment of the Victory Stele of Ea Natum, or also known as the Stele of the Vultures. Now, a stele is a carved stone slab that's erected to commemorate a historical event. So it might be a grave, or in this case, a victory. This is basically the documentation, it's a labeled historical narrative of the battle between Lagash and Umma, and these are both city-states in the region of Sumer. Now, Ensi is the vocabulary term that means ruler. So, Eanatum is the Ensi of Lagash. Now, guys, I know there are a lot of words here. Just have fun with it. Embrace it. Don't resist it. Just, you know, take it and go with it. So here we have a historical document, right? It is giving us a record of what's happened. All the cuneiform inscriptions all over it are telling us the name of the ruler, the city-states that are fighting, how effective and victorious the battle was. So really important that right off the bat, we already know who is victorious. Now, the population wasn't necessarily literate. Some of them were. So for those who were, they could read the cuneiform. But for those who weren't, the images were pretty much enough. So let's take a look at that. All right, let's see how the iconography of power plays out in the stele. First of all, you notice Anatum depicted twice, upper register and the lower register. He's in the front, he's powerful, he takes up the most amount of space, and he is shown leading his infantry battalion into battle. Now his army, right, depicted strong, focused, well armored, orderly, organized, right? All of these features. Whereas the dead enemy, and that little sliver right in between the stele that you're looking at, is naked. Think about why are they naked? Right? What does that do? They're dehumanized. They are stripped of any kind of protection. There's no armor. They are vulnerable, right? They are shamed. So look at the contrast between the enemy and the army, right? The army is powerful, fully clothed, focused, protected, and the enemy is the exact opposite. And this is a feature we see very, very frequently in works of art. The us versus them, right? The home team versus the away team. Kind of think about the applications of this in our lives, in our contemporary lives. Now, you also notice the inscriptions. I've got a couple of them labeled here in the slide, and that's what's telling us what's going on, right? Who is fighting who, what are the city-states that are involved, and of course, who is victorious. A couple of comments about Eonatum's depiction. He is the largest figure, as we mentioned, so that's hierarchy of scale put to use once again. He is fearlessly paving the way for the generals. But I want you to notice the hairdo, right? This kind of bun in the back. I've got the arrows here as well. That was a symbol of Sumerian kingship. And I'm pointing it out because we're going to see the next culture that takes over and how the ruler of that culture will adopt the same hairdo to show continuity, even though really that was not the case. Another piece of the stele that we have is this detail right here with the vultures that are eating the heads of the dead enemy. And once again, you can see, right, that the enemy body is just left for dead, left for the vultures, left to just dishonorably, right, die, basically. And really important to think about what that says about their relationship to the enemy. And in this one, this is the god Ningirsu with the enemies in a net, right? Another detail from the fragment of the stele that we have. I want to point this out here. So Eonatum is claiming victory, but he's acknowledging the god as being part of that. This is really, really important because in a sense, then this acted as a votive offering, saying that he attributes part of that victory to the god, right? Ningirsu was part of that, and that's really important for the Sumerian rulers to do, right? To acknowledge the divine help that they receive. All right, and finally, the question we will keep asking throughout the whole semester. What is the significance, right? What does this object tell us about Sumerian society? So here you go. You've gotten the nature of the ruler. You know what his role is during battle. You have warfare techniques, right? They're on foot, the spears and the shields and the helmets they're using. The ruler sometimes is also in a chariot, right? All of these forms. And then, of course, just historically, that the city-states were quite often at war with one another. In this case specifically, it's the war between Lagash and Umma. Now, another significant point about this object is that the victory is shown in two ways. Human effort by the king and his army, but also divine assistance, right, as Ningirsu is shown here.